Hi everyone, great to see so many people joining, fantastic. It's sad that we can't all be together in the same room, but it's wonderful to at least have a lovely evening launching and celebrating this wonderful book. My name is Chloe, I'm commissioning editor at Andersen Press, and we're here to celebrate the publication of We Played with Fire by Catherine Barter, and you can see the cover on the screen right now. Fen Coles will be chatting to Catherine about the book in just a bit. Just a little bit about Fen. She is co-director of Letterbox Library, a long-established bookseller and workers' cooperative, which specialises in inclusive books for children. And she also runs the Little Rebels Children's Book Award. Catherine Barter is our wonderful author. We Played with Fire is her second novel, and it explores the true tale of the Fox sisters. Who are the Fox sisters? You will find out tonight. Troublemakers, her first novel, was highly praised and shortlisted for the Warstones Children's Book Prize. And take it from me, they're both brilliant reads. So over to you, Fen and Catherine.
Thank you so much, Chloe.
Thank you, Chloe. Thank you.
Hi, Fen.
Catherine. Hiya.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm very excited.
Yeah,
I think you know, I've already told you that.
I've got my Prosecco.
Listen, I've been so excited that I've done huge amounts of reading. I reread Troublemakers.
Oh wow.
I read We Played with Fire.
That's
put in post-its.
Amazing.
Not once, but twice. And that's my little visual, my visual summary of the reading I've been doing of your work. I read Troublemakers again, and I read We Played with Fire twice, and I did all of that within about 3 weeks. And it was really easy because you are so adept at creating exciting plots, and there is so much that I want to talk to you about, and I know I'm not going to get all the stuff in that I'd like to discuss with you. But I'm thinking, for now, just for the sake of the people that are here, and thank you so much everyone for being here, it's lovely to have you. For the sake of the people that are here who haven't read your novel, and you know it is only just out today, so that's probably the majority of the people listening in, would you feel happy just giving us a bit of a summary of the novel itself, but also your inspiration for the novel, so the Fox sisters themselves?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I guess I kind of feel like I have to introduce the Fox sisters before I introduce the novel in a way. I kind of feel like you need that before you get to the fictional part. So maybe I'll do that first. I don't know how many people in the audience. It's so nice seeing everyone say hi in the chat. I don't know how many people have heard of the Fox sisters or whatever, looked up the Wikipedia before they came to this launch, but I think that's where I start. So the kind of public story of the Fox sisters starts in 1848, when the Fox family, so their parents John and Margaret and the two youngest daughters Kate and Maggie, who were 11 and 14 at the time, were living in this kind of remote hamlet that doesn't exist anymore called Hydesville in western New York State. And they'd moved there from sort of busy, bustling Rochester in the middle of winter, and all through the March of 1848, which had been kind of brutally cold, a brutally cold winter, the whole family were hearing sort of weird sounds in the house, things they couldn't explain, sort of knocks and taps in the walls and even footsteps on the stairs. And they were all getting quite freaked out by this, and they'd had neighbours round to listen to it, and they couldn't explain it, and there was just a real atmosphere of kind of fear and confusion about what was going on. And one night, actually the 31st of March, something a bit different happened, and the two girls decided to start trying to communicate with this spirit or this presence or whatever it was that seemed to be haunting the house. And they called out to it and started asking questions and getting it to answer with raps. So like one rap for yes, two raps for no. And there was this big kind of dramatic night where all the neighbours came around, and they were all kind of gathered together in this upstairs bedroom, listening to this sort of conversation going on between these two girls and this spirit who revealed itself to be the ghost of a peddler who had been murdered and was buried in the basement of the house a few years before they moved in. So that was the night where their sort of fame and their story began. And not very long after that, there was a kind of enterprising young journalist who came along and heard about all this excitement and wrote a pamphlet documenting all the people who've been there and their experience, and published it. And it was a kind of little mini bestseller, basically, and word started spreading about these girls who could apparently have found a way to communicate with the dead. And soon they were being asked to conduct seances, first just in other people's homes, but soon in bigger venues, in public, in hotels, in city halls, and things like that. And it started this sort of trend of people wanting to try spiritual communication for themselves at home, in their parlours, in their kitchens. And this movement, based on the belief that the dead were still with us and could be communicated with, was of course called Spiritualism, and that's where it kind of began. And that was the beginning of the Fox sisters, who went on then their entire lives basically were careers as professional mediums. So that was sort of their story. And in my book, We Played with Fire, which is in some respects hews quite closely to the truth, and in other respects not, but it's told from Maggie's perspective, and she's 15 in this book. And at the time of all these goings on in Hydesville, she is also dealing with a kind of terrifying, violent, actually, encounter that she's had, that she thinks is a supernatural encounter, basically, but that no one believes her about. And she's kind of dealing with her frustration, and she's being kind of ignored and dismissed by the adults, and particularly the men in her life. And that frustration kind of bubbles up into her playing these games in the house to try and convince her father that it's haunted. But something seems to start playing games back with them, and the whole thing sort of slips out of her control a little bit. And that's where the story starts.
Yeah, no spoilers. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to have to cut you off.
I know, I was just going to tell the entire thing now.
Don't give it away. So your the novel actually starts out with the Hydesville hauntings, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. So it takes its cue from that, and it's that haunting that the pamphlet was written about. There's a journalist who wrote this pamphlet. It's an incredibly rich source, for your novel, from what I can gather. So you were able to actually access that online, is that right?
Yeah, I dug it up somewhere, the PDF. There's one of these kind of archives online somewhere of like 10 million, documents related to spiritualism, set up by a spiritualist society, I think, a sort of believing, practicing spiritual society. And I found it sort of buried on there. And yeah, it's interesting. So it's this collection of first-hand testimonies, basically. There's kind of an introduction, and then there's lots of testimonies from 20 people or something like that, but not from Kate and Maggie.
And here's the remarkable thing, because the remarkable thing is that the Fox sisters, and I only know this because of you, Catherine, are credited with the birth of spiritualism, and yet this pamphlet summarises the testimony of everyone except for the two sisters, except for Maggie and Kate. Yeah, which is extraordinary. So your novel is a kind of act of reparation in that sense. You've put their voices back, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I guess that's what I was trying to do. And I mean, I guess as well, in a sense, their whole career, they became famous, but they were famous for sort of, so in a sense, they're very well known, but they were famous for kind of channeling the voices of spirits. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, it's still not there. They're still kind of mysterious, I think, in the whole written histories of the Fox sisters. They're still slightly kind of missing in a way. Do you know what I mean? Like behind all the spirit talking and all of that stuff. So yeah, trying to find their voices was sort of the project that I
undertook. Okay. And I remember you saying to me, because I asked you before, because we had a chat on Zoom a while back for a Books for Keeps article, which is out today, everyone, by the way, online, do look it up. But we talked about whether you would classify this as a work of historical fiction, and you started immediately talking about having a playful relationship to the truth, which I love. I love the way you talk about that. And it's also something you refer to at the back of the novel. And you sort of say, forgive me, reader, if I've been playful with the truth. But I think the sisters themselves would appreciate that. Now, for me as a reader, the hypertension of your novel is that you're treading this really delicate line between whether these hauntings, these voices, you know, these knocks on the wall are real, or whether these teenage girls running seances across New York in the end, whether they're fraudulent. And I wanted you to talk a little bit more about that, and perhaps whether you yourself actually, what's your belief in their powers to communicate, do you think? Do you think it was all just trickery?
So, I mean, I guess, yeah, like, I guess one of the things I wanted to do was kind of escape the sort of binary view of the Fox sisters, that they were either frauds or they were gifted mediums, and kind of explore the idea that they might have been both. I feel like if you look them up, most places that you kind of come across references to them, it usually quite quickly says, oh, the Fox sisters, blah, 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 they were frauds, a lot of which is based upon famously Maggie in adulthood, after sort of 40 years of spiritualism, turned around and said, no, it was all, we were faking it. We were cracking bones in our ankles to create these raps. And so for a lot of people, I think that's like a case closed. Okay, they were frauds. But I did kind of feel like I think there's a more interesting story there. And even if, you know, even if Maggie denounced it later in life, that doesn't mean she didn't believe it at some point in her life. I think our, you know, belief is quite a complicated thing, and our beliefs change over time, and we can convince ourselves that something is real and then later not believe it anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's kind of a messy line, I think, and I didn't want to have this idea of like, oh, this is a story showing how the Fox sisters were frauds, or this is a story showing how it was all real and you know, everything they did. I'm certain that there was some trickery, because I don't think ghosts, you know, would show up 3 times a day at, you know, a hotel and communicate reliably by knocking on the table. So for sure there was fakery going on, but I can't help thinking that, you know, there might have been something else.
Of course,
but it's just more interesting story. Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, of course. I mean, you keep it so ambiguous. I love that, because just reading it, you know, as far as I was concerned, I opened that book and I was witnessing a haunted house. That was what was happening. You know, I thought, I know my horror. I know you know your horror. And I thought, I'm seeing the tropes here. This is a haunted house. Okay. And I found that very credible. And then all of a sudden the gear shifts. And I think, okay, it is just these teenagers who are incredibly adept at bone cracking. A wonderful skill.
yeah, really useful.
I mean, wouldn't we all like to be able to crack our bones beneath the table? But and then it would kind of slip again. And I do that's for me the kind of real excitement of this novel. And so then I kept wondering whether you actually see it as Gothic fiction yourself, because I know you're really you're a very well versed kind of Gothic narrative person, because you're very well versed in horror films, but you've also got a really extensive background in American cultural studies, and you talked about doing a Gothic module on that course. It just sounds fascinating. I know you're well read in Gothic literature yourself. So yes, well, I think you are. So We Played with Fire isn't quite historical fiction. It is and it isn't. So what about its relationship to being a Gothic novel? Would you class it as a Gothic novel?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? And I know I often find when I'm talking about it, I keep dodging, and I am doing it now, I keep dodging the question of a straightforward, like, are the ghosts real or aren't they? Because like I said, I kind of, that ambiguity is part of what I like about the story. Is it a Gothic novel? I mean, one of the things that, like you say, I did American studies and American literature. at university, and one of the ideas I remember coming across was sort of exploring what is an American Gothic, because you think of Gothic literature as kind of traditionally emerging out of these sort of old crumbling European castles and those kind of settings, and like what would the Gothic mean in America, which is meant to be this kind of bright new land of light and progress and order and rationalism. And kind of thinking about the idea that I remember reading a definition that the Gothic is about the return of the repressed, and it's about things that are supposed to be buried sort of returning when they shouldn't, which works kind of literally in the Gothic and works in the case of this story because there's a murdered peddler in the cellar of their house. But there's also a sense of like, what are the things in society that have been buried and that we don't want to hear and that are being kind of repressed. And in America at this time, you know, a new country that is kind of thinking of itself as sort of enlightened and forward looking and you know, full of kind of progress and rationalism. But there's there are hundreds of thousands of people who are enslaved in this country, and of course, you know, women are sort of silenced and cut out of power, and there are all these voices that and there's an entire population that's been displaced from the land, you know, violently. So there's all these kind of simmering tensions and violences and silences and oppressions that are kind of lurking beneath the surface in America at this time. So I think there's a kind of Gothicism that's associated with that. That doesn't even have to be supernatural. Do you know what I mean? It's about like a sense of things that are oppressed and are pushing themselves up through the ground. So by that definition, I think it's kind of a Gothic novel.
Absolutely. No, I agree with you. And there's a wonderful line in the novel where is it Maggie's teacher who describes, I might have got the character wrong, but she describes the country as a country that's being built on bones, which I think is a beautiful moment because it, you know, it works literally, it works very symbolically as well. But you've really brought in so this idea that I mean, I know a lot of American Gothic is built on as you say, the idea of the repressed returning, and also guilt and kind of ancient sins. And of course, one of the things that's really prevalent in We Played with Fire is the political engagement. So it's set against this background of, well, I'm going to get you to describe it really, but I'm just thinking that you posit Rochester as this incredible space, this town, where there's a flurry of activity, political activity, but also around abolitionism in particular and suffrage. But also there's a lot of movement through that city, isn't it? It's very restless. So you have the enslaved escaping from the south. Then there's references to the gold rush, but then there's also references to the telegraph. There's this incredible kind of medley of progress and past sins and politics. Talk a little bit more about that, because it's an incredible success of the novel, really, that you've packed in so much of that ideology and rich history, I think.
Yeah.
That was a long question.
No, it's interesting. I mean, it was almost kind of lucky in a way to like come across all of that when I was researching it, because I think initially, you know, I'd come across the Fox sisters a few times over the years, and you know, there was a kind of niggling idea that there was a YA novel in it, but I think I was drawn to it because it was sort of like, oh, you know, ghosts. And then quite quickly, when I started researching, I found out that there were all these kind of intersections between the Fox sisters and the kind of radical politics of the time, and particularly centered around the city of Rochester. And a lot of that came through Amy and Isaac Post, who are characters in the book, but who were real people, and they were radical Quakers, and they were very involved in a lot of the sort of radical activist movements at the time. So they were very involved in abolition, and their home was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and they were also very involved with women's rights. And they were very close friends of the Fox sisters. The Fox sisters actually lived with them for a while. And they were kind of among the first sort of enthusiastic advocates of spiritualism, and started spreading it among their friends, and took it very seriously. And it was a really kind of sincere part of their religious practice, which was also bound up with their activism, if you know what I mean. So I didn't really know anything about any of that, and I kind of discovered it I discovered it quite quickly in the research. And yeah, I think it's very significant that a lot of spiritualism came out of Rochester, which, as you say, at this time was rapidly expanding kind of hub of intellectual energy. And like Frederick Douglass lived there for a while. He set up his newspaper there, and like Susan B. Anthony lived there, and all these kind of radical figures of the time. So yeah, and then there's a kind of fascinating question which is immediately being posed, which is like, is there a connection here? Because a lot of spiritualists were also radical, you know, abolitionists and women's rights. There was a big intersection between those.
And why would that be? Why would that be? Because I found that fascinating.
They're asked, and then it does make a kind of sense, I think, because spiritualism, as it kind of broke out as a sort of popular movement, it was kind of decentralized, and it was non-hierarchical. You know, insofar as it had any leaders, they tended to be women. It was certainly quite female dominated. It could take place in the home. You didn't need ministers, you didn't need buildings, you could do it at your kitchen table. And so it had a kind of like punky sort of DIY radical spirit, for lack of better words, that can kind of see why it was appealing to kind of activists and people engaged with that kind of politics at the time. You know, it's kind of disruptive and kind of slightly anarchic and sort of breaking loose from.
Was it quite fashionable as well, would you say?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I mean, I think it did sort of take off. I think it took off in different ways, because for some people it was like a very sincere, I think for the posts actually, it was quite a sincere kind of expression of religious faith. And then it also, I think, took off as a kind of parlor game that was just a bit of a lark for the, you know, middle classes or however. And it was took place as a kind of public thing that you could go and pay to see. So I guess it was kind of fashionable, but it had different sort of, it fragmented into different kind of strands and had different meaning, different groups of people, I think.
Interesting. We've had a question, which I'd be very interested in hearing your views about. So we've had a question: what is there about this novel that makes it a teen novel rather than an adult novel? Thank you for that question. And I was wondering about that, because I was wondering what it was you thought particularly about the story of the Fox sisters. What is it that made that amenable to the genre of YA, or to the audience of YA, would you say? It's not obvious on the surface.
Yeah, do you not think?
No, I suppose I don't think it's necessarily obvious on the surface, because I don't know, because the material is so sort of complex. But I mean, tell me what it is. When you discovered their story, there was obviously something that struck you, that made you imagine a YA voice and a YA audience as well. Yeah, I mean, I think I always find it really difficult to think about what the difference is between YA and adult fiction, aside from there's usually teenage characters. But I think like one of the things that YA and children's literature, but especially YA, does quite well is kind of tell stories about power and powerlessness. Because I think, you know, the condition of being a teenager is at a very fraught space between those two things. You're kind of coming into independence and your own identity and stuff, but you kind of don't, you still are a child and you don't really have any power, and you're constantly kind of butting up against adulthood, basically, in these kind of institutions. And that's sort of what my first book, Troublemakers, which is really different in some ways, but in other ways maybe not, is about. It's a 15-year-old girl who's kind of trying to assert herself and find her own voice and her independence, and kind of meeting this resistance from the adults in her life. And so that's kind of, this felt like a story about kind of rebellion and disruption, and a story where there's a lot of tension between adults and teenagers, basically. It just felt like there was a lot there in those kind of like tensions and unresolved issues. And I mean, I think one of the things that makes
YA novels often is also like voice and perspective, and having a kind of limited, a story that's like from one perspective and very much inhabiting one character, which both of my YA novels do, because you're also getting into that kind of like very immediate teenage sense of, finding yourself and how you see the world. And you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's really striking, that really links your first novel, Troublemakers, with this one, because initially I thought that's really interesting. It's such a skip of genre. So for those of you who haven't read Troublemakers, I would call it contemporary social realism. And then you have We Played with Fire, which is historical fiction / Gothic. I've decided that might change tomorrow. So for me, it in some ways it felt like quite a leap. But in another way, the thing that really unites them is you do have this kind of very striking teen voice that obviously is commanding the narrative, with a backdrop, though, of political disharmony in some way, or political bubbling up or troubles. And it's about how that young person negotiates that, whether they are powerless in the face of that, do you think? Whether they can find their place in that? I mean,
Yeah.
is that this kind of strong link for you? Did it feel like it was almost carrying through that voice from Troublemakers into this one?
Yeah, I think so, a little bit. And I feel like both characters are kind of having the experience of being sort of slightly condescended to by adults. The main character in Troublemakers, Lena, is being kind of her older brother, who's her guardian, has kind of kept this secret, quite major secret, from her about their family, and kind of refusing to tell her the sort of truth about their family, which is, it comes out of a protective impulse, but it's a kind of condescending thing to do, and it's not respecting you as a person who can deal with the truth and deal with reality. And I feel like Maggie slightly has the same experience with the adults in her life, in that they kind of condescend to her and don't believe her and don't take her seriously. And so there's a sort of similar tension there. And they both have a very similar relationship, I think, which is between an much older sibling who's also a kind of surrogate parent, because with the Fox sisters, their much older sister Leah, who was in their 30s, kind of swept onto the scene when it all started kicking off, and became a medium herself, and also became like their business manager, and kind of they much later in life, I think, accused her of having exploited them, basically. But there's that a similar sort of tension between a kind of like, surrogate parent figure, and are they trying to do the best for you, and how much power do they have over you, and that kind of. So yeah, they're really different stories in some ways, but I think quite similar.
Are they rebels? Are your protagonists rebels, would you say?
Yes, but I think they do also feel hemmed in by their families and friends and societies, and they're not just like going out and like, oh yeah, smash the system. I think they have quite complicated relationships with working out who they are and what they believe in and what they want to do. Yeah.
So one of the things that I loved about the character of Maggie is she's actually very funny. She's very wry. And I wonder sometimes, actually, I saw that humour. It's your humour, I know. I saw that humour in Troublemakers, and I can see it in We Played with Fire as well. And for me, some of the greatest kind of comic moments in a novel, which isn't a comedy, is Maggie's commentary on the adults around her. This is what was making me think of her as being a very rebellious spirit, but it's particularly on the men around her. So there are so many references dotted about where she says, oh, well, of course, nobody believes what me and my sister are doing, so we're just going to have to bring in some men to testify to it, and then they'll all listen. And it's so sort of sardonic and sarky. I think you really capture that kind of teen voice. Were those funny moments for you?
I hope so.
Say? Yeah.
I really don't. I am really put off by like fiction for teenagers or young people generally that's really po-faced and kind of either in its politics or in its relationships or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's not my cup of tea. So I'm glad to hear that she has kind of yeah, a bit of
She
kind of
does.
humor.
I'm going to give you a classic line from it, because I've done post-it
Yay, I love
all
that.
over your novel. I mean, I wouldn't even know where to start, but this is the sort of tone that I'm talking about. So this is quite early on in the novel. So we've witnessed or not witnessed, depending on how you think about it, the Hydesville haunting. So think of it as a haunted house. And Maggie and Kate, the two sisters, are at the centre of it. And her family and neighbours are variously testifying to it. But there's this wonderful moment where Maggie's father, who is hoping to stay resolutely cynical in the face of all of it, says, "I'm going to go and fetch David and Calvin. That's what I'll do. They need to hear this." Of course, thought Maggie, more men had to be fetched. Who could know what was real or not without a few men to say for certain? I just think it's so brilliantly done. I love that. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I like that line as well.
And of course, then unavoidably, it makes me think about whether, to what degree you would consider your rebels and troublemakers and We Played with Fire, but let's focus on We Played with Fire. Do you see them as feminist rebels? Is Maggie actually a feminist troublemaker herself?
The character.
Is it a feminist novel? Is that a huge question?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I mean, there's obviously a lot of gender tied up with spiritualism in general. Like, I think you can't think about it or write about it without kind of engaging with feminist politics a bit, because it was very, very female dominated, and it was kind of started by these two young girls, and it's certainly frustration at kind of male authority that gives it its kind of explosive energy, I think. So do you think it's a feminist novel?
I do know. I had a very strong sense of it as a feminist novel, because so what I saw these teenage sisters. They basically instigate a movement that confounds the men in their domestic sphere and in the wider sphere. So they confound their brother, their father, local ministers, and so on and so on. And I think what they're confounding is two things. So I think within the domestic sphere, they're beyond the control of the domestic, literally, because they're channeling voices. So they're kind of escaping the control of their father, their kind of literal patriarch. But then beyond that sphere, they're threatening the world of faith, which is already being threatened by new sciences, by things like, you know, the discovery of the telegraph, for example, at that time. And also, it's just that spiritualism is, you evoke it as this kind of world of women. So women running their parlor games or running their seances, depending on how you think of it. Women sharing stories about ghosts and about spirits with each other and becoming excited about those things together. And it's this kind of messy, disruptive, anarchic world. So I guess I see it as a feminist novel.
Yeah, good. I mean, I would hope that it is, and like, I am a feminist, and I would hope that like is reflected in my writing. I think I sometimes feel a bit hesitant because I don't know that these girls are like feminists, not like woohoo, like kick-ass feminist heroines, you go girl. Like, they're complicated young women, and there's some dubious, moral kind of ambiguity to what they do as well. I think, like, obviously, much of what they did, they were charging money for it, and I'm sure for some people, clear exploitation of grief and bereavement. So it's not like, there's a certain kind of like feminist YA book, which is great and brilliant, but that it's quite like, really empowered portrayals of either historical women who've been overlooked or kind of young women coming into their voices. And I do feel like the Fox sisters have such a messy like relationship with everything they do, that's the kind of thing where I feel like it's sort of a bit, the feminist aspect of it is a bit complicated. But as you say, like, I do think what they did historically was disruptive and anarchic, and it's, I kind of have have this played out in the book a little bit, but there were people were so angry with them when they were very young. They had like angry mobs kind of chasing them to their houses when they're like 12 and 15, and they had sort of religious leaders who are very angry because they're like, you're doing the work of the devil and you're witches, and they've got kind of scholarly, rational men who are furious because they're frauds and desperate to expose them. And I'm like, why are these men so angry at these girls for what they're doing? Do you know what I mean? And I think that's still, that's always a fascinating question, I think, when people are very, very angry with young women.
Have I got permission to read something else from your book?
Yes,
I'm taking my cue from you here. So this is so all you need to know really is that Maggie has just been to a funeral of somebody that she really loves. No spoilers again. So she's quite vulnerable. She's very sad. And this is what the minister who was meant to be administering the funeral says to her: "You will listen to me if you care about your soul, Maggie. It is not the place of women to mediate between the spiritual world and this one. It is the job of men who have been called. Your activities threaten the moral order of our society. You've strayed from the Christian path. I'm sorry to speak harshly, but you must be told and you must be warned." I mean, that's pretty threatening, isn't it?
And I think that's exactly how how people felt. And like, it wasn't, wasn't a kind of unusual observation, because I think women, certainly then were kind of viewed as this like sort of danger zone of, they're very susceptible to strange ideas and, the advances of the devil. And, there's a kind of like, I don't know, there's a sort of fear of like a sense that like young women have some kind of weird power that needs to be controlled. That I think is
yes, and that was the other thing I was thinking with the other thing that makes the Fox Sisters story sort of receptive to a YA novel is there's quite a long tradition, isn't there, of associating teenage girls with strange gothic happenings. I don't know if I've been listening. I'm totally gripped by this new podcast about the Battersea hauntings, which took place kind of just over 100 years after the ones that we're talking about with the Fox Sisters. And there's like a 15-year-old girl at the centre of it. And then when I think of some of the horror films that I love, like Carrie and Poltergeist, there she is again. We've got actually Poltergeist, she's younger, isn't she? But there is a long genre of horror that puts a kind of troubled teenage pubescent girl at the centre of something quite demonic. I mean, what do you think that's about?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Yeah, there's this kind of sense that like the trauma of adolescence and the kind of raging hormones or whatever it is can kind of induce these like psychic disturbances and objects. Which, I mean, having been a teenage girl, I can understand and believe. I think there is a lot of there's a lot going on, and when you're also confronted with like a patriarchal society, there's a lot of like just broiling tension and stuff. And it's an interesting, but yeah, I think that sort of trope as like a kind of trope in horror and whatever also does slightly speak to that kind of fear and ambivalence about teenage girls and what they might do and what kind of power they might have if you don't keep them in check. Yeah, there is definitely something weird, because there's the Enfield hauntings as well that we were talking about the other day, which again is another like true instance of a haunting that was young girls kind of speaking with the voices of spirits and objects flying around and stuff. It's really fascinating. Yeah,
and that idea about voices is central to We Played with Fire. And I know that sounds obvious, but one of my favourite secondary characters in the book is Elizabeth. Her name changes, doesn't it?
Yes, it's Reed and then it's Garrett. Yeah.
So yeah, can you just tell people a little bit about her, because she draws together a lot of the kind of different narratives of the book, I think, and says a lot about voices and kind of political discourse and so
she's a young Black woman who's kind of in Amy Post's sort of circle of activist friends, and she is involved in working on the Underground Railroad, but also involved in the kind of women's rights movements. And that was, the Posts did kind of, their home was a bit of a kind of hub for different activists across all these movements. but I think I was conscious of not wanting to also like idealize all the kind of activist politics of the time. And she has the experience, as I think a lot of Black women did, of the sort of white women in the feminist movement don't really want to have her speak, and feel like she'll sort of distract from their issue by making it all about race. And abolitionists kind of don't want to have her speak because they feel like she'll distract from their issue with issues about gender. I mean, that's a nice way of putting it, that white women also were, plenty racist, and plenty of abolitionists were sexist, and those things were kind of colliding. So she's experiencing this kind of like double silencing, and people don't want to hear her voice. And yeah, I think that idea more broadly about voices and who we listen to and who gets to be heard was one of the themes I was exploring. And yeah, she's definitely a character who kind of exists.
What struck me as well about that is that idea that if you have an identity which is considered somehow intersectional, that it means you're splintering out other people's movements, or your own movements, as it turns out. It's
very like, sorry, it feels like, as you know, like it's still, this is still a big issue, and there's still, you're distracting from class politics with your, feminist concerns or whatever.
Yeah, well, I was laughing with you, wasn't I, about how Betty Friedan called lesbians who joined the feminist movement, she referred to them as the Lavender Menace, because she thought they were, distracting. But what struck me about that, by having that character, is that, she's a really interesting character, and she does bring together a lot of your thinking around voices and which voices get heard and which voices are the loudest, and I love that characterization for that. It also struck me that even as recently as 5 years ago, it wouldn't have resonated quite as much as now, because although that's an ongoing issue within political circles about who's silenced, who's heard, it's really contemporary now, isn't it? I mean, I think young people's particularly, or many young people's understanding of political voices is much more sophisticated than it used to be. So although it's an ages-old problem, I thought it had really kind of quite modern relevance. I don't know, do you share that? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think you can't write anything without like having the influence of your time and the politics that you're surrounded by. So yeah, I think it's I'm sure I probably wouldn't have been writing that story in the same way if it wasn't for those kind of political conversations happening around. And I'm glad that it feels like, it has modern relevance as well.
I mean, you really live and breathe your politics, don't you?
Yeah. I guess the thing is, I'm really booking, like I work in a radical bookshop, so I am kind of sort of surrounded by radical politics, but at the same time it's a bookshop. So I'm always conscious that I'm not like I'm not on the barricades. I'm not like a real sort of frontline direct action activist. I live my politics, but in a very booky sort of safe way.
Well, thank goodness for people like you, though. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's not just that you work in a political bookshop. You're co-manager of a political bookshop, so you do have quite a lot of say in its direction. But you co-run the Little Rebels Award for radical children's fiction with us at Letterbox Library, and you're very you're very knowledgeable about political literature generally, just because what comes into the shop and what you read. So you must feel like your novels are also really contributing to YA political fiction, which I think is having a real heyday. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you see your books as being part of that political landscape?
Yeah, I mean, I hope so. I think it's kind of hard to like place your own books in a wider context, because you have such a weird, close relationship with them. But I definitely, like you say, I do think that YA is kind of a front line for sort of radical fiction at the moment. It's really exploding with kind of disruptive, sort of critical, socially engaged energy, and exploring race and class and misogyny and rape culture and all of these really urgent topics. So yeah, I mean, I definitely feel that when buying YA fiction for the shop, and if mine is part of that, that's really good. I think I can't help it. Like, as you say, when you're kind of in one of those worlds, like it's like being political is a sort of habit of thoughts. Like I wouldn't really know how to write a story that wasn't political in some way, because that's kind of, I don't know, if you're just wired up to see the world that way at a certain point, aren't you?
No, when I speak to you, I always think that phrase from the 70s, the personal is the political, was made for you. You know, I think you embody that, and
Yeah,
thank goodness. I mean, I think your novels are a really, really, really significant part of that canon. I'm going to. I'm distracted by the questions now, aren't you?
I think we're supposed to read them.
Oh, we should read them, because they're really coming in now. Do you want to pick, Catherine, or do you want me to?
Let me pick one, and then maybe you can pick one. Jane, hi Jane. Catherine, could you explain a bit about your writing process? How much time did you spend on research? What is your routine on a daily basis? And do you ask for other people's opinions as you were writing? I wish I had a writing process. This book would have been written a lot quicker, probably. I think I spending time on research, like I didn't do loads of research in a block and then start writing the book. I kind of started writing the book and did the research as I went, because I kind of discovered I came up against all the questions I wanted to know the answer to. So the research and the writing time were kind of the same thing for me. They were sort of meshed together. And because I have a job, and also because I'm a procrastinator and, you know, like lying around watching TV, I have never had like a really good writing routine. I've never been a person who, you know, gets up at 7 and writes for 2 hours and then makes breakfast and writes for another 2 hours. So it was written in a kind of slightly like shambolic, you know, way, like whenever inspiration strikes, and then I can't write for 3 months, and like I wish I had good writing habits, but I don't, and I have no, you know, if anyone ever asks me for writing advice, I have nothing to say, because it took me so long to write this. It took me so long to write my last book. It's I haven't quite mastered the discipline of writing, you know, properly, like proper writers do.
And yet, look what you've come out with. Seriously, I like this question. Can I nudge in here, because I'm liking this question about Julia's asking about whether the sisters monetize their experience.
Yeah, is that a question? Yes, it did. I mean, yeah, no, they absolutely did, and I think that's one of the things you can level again. One of the reasons I'm a bit reluctant to be like, "Woo, the Fox sisters, let's celebrate them," is they were certainly in the murky capitalist world of making money from what they did. I mean, I think they were really, like I said, they were really young when they started, and by the time Maggie was 15, she was doing these like daily seances in a hotel for $3 a meeting kind of thing. And I think that's a lot where their older sister Leah comes in and kind of she had the sort of entrepreneurial spirit a bit. So in a way, they were a little bit exploited, I think, by being pushed into that life. But yeah, they did. They monetized it, and you know, that's all well and good when people are just going along for a laugh. But obviously, when people are grieving and they're being told that they're contacting, you know, a lost one, then that's a lot murkier, and still is with people who do these kind of things. So yes, they did. They were, in a way, they were like mid 19th century, you know, grafters. They had, you know, this was their hustle that they had going on, and they're very successful there.
They also didn't come from money, did they? I mean, not that I'm trying to excuse it.
No, they didn't. They were sort of working class girls. You know, father was a blacksmith, and you know, it's a complicated one.
And the older sister was raising a child on her own. That can't have been easy, and from quite a young age, right? Yeah,
she was like a teen. She had her child when she was 14, I think. She was really young. And
this is Leah, by the way.
Leah Fox. Yeah, so I don't know if that influenced her kind of eagerness to. I mean, I'm saying she's like this hard-headed business manager. That's not how she wrote. One of the big things very useful thing in my research was she wrote a very long, kind of dotty, self-aggrandizing book about which is very sincere, and it's you know, absolutely straight-faced, you know, talking to spirits. This is what we did. We, you know, brought joy and comfort to millions of people. and it's really it's got like glowing slime and levitating, and like it's absolutely it's an unreliable source, I would say. But it's completely sincere, and so maybe she was, really in it for the spirits and not for the money. But
it does sound like a great read. It sounds like a great read.
I don't know if it is a great read. It's
no.
It's slightly self-serving, but yeah, it's interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I pick another one, or do you want to pick one?
No, yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So Tracy says that she loves the title of the book. Did it come easily, or were there several versions? I really like the title too.
Good. I'm glad. I do as well. Yeah. I'm really rubbish at titles, and I think Troublemakers didn't have a title till right at the end. And yeah, I think for a long time it was just called The Fox Sisters. And it wasn't me who came up with the title, and I wish I knew who it was, because it came from Andersen, and I'm not sure if it was Chloe or if it was someone else there. But yeah, it wasn't for me, and I really like it as well, because I think it's it captures that kind of sense of things getting out of control, and playing with something dangerous that you don't quite know what it is. Oh, Chloe says, I think it was Sarah, the Andersen.
Oh, okay. Brilliant. Thank you.
Excited too.
Okay. I've got right. So Duncan says, Catherine, you've mentioned that you're drawn to ghost stories. Do you have any favourites? Yes, I asked her this as well. Catherine, tell us.
I mean, as you know, Fen, I am a big fan of horror films, and I've seen a lot more of those in a way than I've read. I've read books, I think, but big fan of Turn of the Screw, a kind of classic, that Henry James, a kind of classic, walking that line between sort of what's real and what isn't, and kind of psychological ambiguity, and 19th century repressed emotions and those kind of things. And yeah, I like Shirley Jackson, because she's got that kind of dark humor, combined with ghostly goings on. And who is that author you sent me? You sent me a book by.
Oh, she's actually a YA author, but then she did a couple of adult books. It's Michelle Paver, isn't it?
Michelle Paver,
Dark Matter, is that right?
Matter. Yeah, she tells a good ghost story. I've read all of hers now, I think.
That was truly terrifying.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I love that book.
Yeah, truly terrifying. Okay, now I love Shirley Jackson from Joe. Yeah. Joe, we should talk about that.
That's what I love about Shirley Jackson.
Now we've only got a couple of minutes left, really. Do you want to pick one more question, Catherine, or?
Yeah, I think we can pick a couple. It doesn't
Okay.
The tech doesn't cut out at 8 o'clock.
Okay.
We can go a few minutes over. Nicola Martin, morning writer or evening writer? Beverage of choice. Give us a glimpse of what your writing time looks like. I
want to hold up your current beverage.
Here's my current beverage, which is Prosecco that was left over from Christmas. I probably I write better in the morning, but I also hate getting up in the morning. So often I end up writing at night, which is why it takes me so long to write a book, because I don't write this one. And my beverage of choice is, I guess it's coffee in the morning and gin in the evening.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Okay, let me have a look.
Well, look, I'm going to ask you this, because this says Dear Catherine and Fen. It's from Rabia, I think. Which is a cultural moment right now, from Etsy to film to feminism to alt religion, i.e. millennials and astrology. Why do you think that is, and why now? That's quite a big one.
Yeah, so I think Catherine would be really well positioned to answer this. Which is the current fashion for witches?
I don't know. I guess it's a kind of. I mean, I don't actually. It does feel like there's a current thing, but also when I was at school, there was a lot of people who were into witches and witchy kind of culture. So it's not totally new, but I don't know. I guess it does have that slightly anarchic, disruptive sense of it's kind of messing with traditional power and religious authority, and taking certain kinds of power into your own hands is sort of at the hand of the witchy vibe, I think, which is obviously a lot of young people and young women are very politicized now these days, and finding those kind of avenues of expression.
Yeah. I was wondering about that. I was thinking, don't you think that every time feminism has a peak, that witches take another turn in a way? They're an age-old symbol of female empowerment. That's a terribly cliched term, but it does summarize what I want to say very neatly. So I wonder whether they have their heyday in parallel with feminism's heyday. So I don't know. Possibly.
That's a
well, I don't know if it's true. I'm just going with that. I'm going with that. Anyway, I love that question. Can I just say?
It is really interesting. I do think about it quite a lot because we have this thing at Housmans. Like, there's a lot of kind of like witchy themes, sort of.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
People are really interested in, and the same people who are interested in radical politics. But it's like, where do we shelve this stuff? Like, does it have its own section? Does it go like in the feminist section? It's interesting.
Okay.
Thank you so much for all these questions, everybody. It's really nice.
Yes, I know. Do you think we should take one more?
Yeah.
It's up to you. You be in control. Well, I quite like this one. What part of the creative process do you enjoy most, Catherine?
Finishing the book. No, I think it's really fun when you're at the start of a book, I think, and you've got a blank page and you can kind of just play around with new characters and writing dialogue, I think, is my favourite thing to do. So
okay.
Looking into like characters and kind of finding their voices is probably my favourite part of writing, I think. Yeah.
Do you say your dialogue out loud? Do you rehearse it at all?
No, not when I'm writing it. Sometimes later, but no, not when I'm writing. I just kind of, I just kind of hear it in my head. But I think that's and the nice thing about being creative is just like you get to be somewhere else, you get to be out of your head for a little while, which is really nice. I'm going to quickly, because I was going to do this at the beginning and totally forgot, and I don't want to forget, is like do my thank yous.
Yes, do your thank yous, Catherine.
So obviously, like in a different world, this could have been a nice launch at Housmans Bookshop, and I would have just got up and done some thank yous, and then we could have all just mingled and had wine and had a jolly time. But that is not the time that we live in, and so we had to do an actual event with content instead, which I'm very glad to have been able to do. But I will still just say a few thank yous, because this book took a really long time and was a slightly angsty process in some of that time. And I am really very lucky to have a really supportive and encouraging family who are always curious about and interested in what I'm doing. So I always have to say thank you to them. So that is my parents, Nick and Christine, and Stuart and Claire and Rosie and Alan and Kay and Christopher and David and Victoria and and also my partner Rich, who put up a lot of angst over this book, and was very patient. Thank you so much to Andersen Press. This was, as I've said, a bit of a weird direction to go in after Troublemakers, and I was very lucky that they were willing to go with me on it. So thank you to them, and to Charlie Shepherd and Rob Faramond at Andersen Press, and particularly Chloe Sacker, my editor, who helped me find the story that I was trying to tell, which was not as easy as it might have been. Thank you to Ramona Sajeba and Kate Grove and Jack Noel at Andersen Press, who were responsible for this cover, which I love. So good, so grateful.
It is, it's fantastic.
Really cool. Thank you to my amazing agent, Laura Williams. Sorry, I really feel like I'm doing an Oscar.
Do it.
Like my Golden Globe acceptance. Yeah, thank you to Laura Williams, who's so enthusiastic and amazing agent. Caroline Ambrose and the Bath Novel Award, always. My friend Duncan Smith, my Housmans colleagues, Nick and Christina, who are amazing. Thank you to everyone who ordered a copy of the book when they registered for this. Thank you for supporting radical independent bookselling. And also thank you to Fen and Kerry from Letterbox Library, and especially Fen for doing this event with me and being such a great friend and fellow radical bookseller, and being so encouraging and sending me nice messages Those are my thank yous. Sorry, that felt like a really...
No, it's an absolute pleasure.
But,
Okay.
you know, it's important.
No, absolute pleasure. And I want to thank everyone for being here. It's a huge challenge launching a book in lockdown, as lots of you will be aware. So thank you for being here, and thank you for supporting this book and for supporting Catherine. Thank you, Andersen, for bringing this book into the world. But the biggest thanks has got to go to you, Catherine. And it's not just what you write. No, it's you. It's you. No, I thank you. I thank you for your political passion and your political drive. And thank you for putting that into your work. And thank you for respecting young people's voices and giving them this gift of your writing. It's wonderful. And I really do want you all to read the book, because apart from anything else, it's just a really good ghost story. So please buy it, enjoy it. And we probably need to close now. We probably need to close.
I guess so.
But thank you all. And take care.
Thank you so much, everybody.
All right, we'll see you.